Hello and welcome back to The Independent Pianist, and I'm your host, Cole Anderson, and today's video grew out of my own study of Chopin's Etude Opus 10 No. 2. Of course, it's arguable, but this etude may indeed be the most difficult etude that Chopin ever wrote. It certainly doesn't sound like that on your first hearing. It just sounds like a simple chromatic scale being played with kind of a boom-chuck accompaniment on the left hand. However, once you realize that in fact the pianist is playing chords in the right hand with the scale, then you realize that Chopin's doing something rather special in this etude. He's actually going back to a very old-fashioned way of playing the scale, but one that he would have been well familiar with from the writings of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. To wit, the chromatic scale has to be played with only the third, fourth, and fifth fingers of the right hand, while the index and thumb are taking chords. This makes the whole technical difficulty of this etude exponentially harder than you might imagine when you first hear it. Getting your weakest fingers, the fourth and fifth fingers, to move this rapidly and with this kind of ease and relaxation is something which pianists over the nearly 2 centuries since Chopin wrote this etude have been struggling with, and everyone finds their own solutions to it, of course, one way or another. So probably when you saw the title of this video, you probably were expecting that I was going to bring out some performance kind of like this, admittedly great performance by the great German pianist Wilhelm Backhaus, which he plays this etude something like this. So, admittedly, this is a great performance. Backhaus is playing extremely fast, much faster than Chopin's metronome marking. It's very clear, it's very brilliant and imaginative. He's also improvising a little bit, changing some of the left-hand notes, and he improvises a nice little cadenza at the end. This is a recording I've known and admired for a long time. Backhaus's cycle of all the 24 Chopin etudes is definitely worth listening to, but it's actually when I was listening to various recordings of this etude, this is not the one that struck me as being the most remarkable from a musical standpoint. And I'll explain exactly why that is and what recording I actually did end up choosing as my favorite among the many that I listened to. So as I said, I'm studying this piece right now. I'm planning to record it at some point in the future and put it on my channel. You know, I've studied it off and on in the past. I never actually played it in a concert or anything like that, but I've worked on it here and there. It's one of those bugbears which pianists usually at least want to study a little bit, even if you don't decide to play it in public. And in fact, many great pianists never did play this etude in public. Famously, some names like Vladimir Horowitz and Arthur Rubinstein, neither one of them would play this etude in public concerts. And no doubt there are many other great pianists who also chose not to play this etude in public. It's a very dicey affair. It's a very precise kind of technique. It definitely does not sound as difficult as it is, and musically it's a rather unique kind of creation as well. So as I've been studying this piece, I also have been looking at various editions, and I found a rather interesting one by Arthur Friedheim. For those of you who don't know, Arthur Friedheim was one of Liszt's pupils, and actually a pretty prominent one, who performed a great deal, and who also prepared a lot of editions of Liszt's works and also other composers' works. And so I found this edition of Arthur Friedheim of all the Chopin etudes. And one thing that was very interesting to me was actually that Friedheim gives metronome markings, his own metronome markings, which are quite a bit slower generally than Chopin's. This is just another example, if any was needed, of how the tradition of tempi in Liszt's school was probably actually on the slower end of things, in keeping with Wagner's ideas about tempi and the evidence of certain of Liszt's transcriptions, which almost require the performer to take a slightly more stately tempo in order to make everything actually sound. I spoke about this a while ago, actually, when I did a performance of Liszt's transcription of the Confutatis and Lacrimosa from Mozart's Requiem. And there in the Confutatis, the way that he transcribed the piece actually requires the pianist to take a little bit of a slower tempo. But there are examples of that in many other places. So I was quite intrigued to find that Friedheim actually gave a tempo indication of 126 for this etude, which is quite a bit slower than you'll hear people play it, generally speaking. Just to give you an idea of how this etude is usually performed, here's a little bit of it in a famous recording by Maurizio Pollini. And actually, this is a recording I quite like, even though Pollini is not necessarily a pianist that I go to very often, not one that I'm necessarily terribly sympathetic with in his interpretive approach. But this particular recording is actually very, very beautiful and kind of pristine. And he seems to really be trying to exactly bring Chopin's written tempo to life. Quarter note 144. So that's quarter note 144. And actually, I think that this tempo is a very reasonable one, and it has a very unique feeling, which I think that the faster tempo versions, the more kind of frenetic versions, kind of lose this kind of flickering, a ghostly quality to this etude. It's very easy to lose that if you get into this more virtuoso attitude with the left hand getting kind of heavy and having to try to speed along the right hand. It gets more of this kind of frenetic quality. So I listened to recording after recording, trying to find someone who played this piece at quarter note 126. And finally, I actually found one where the pianist sometimes is playing around 126 or so. So I want to play this recording for you without saying who the pianist is, and just so you can kind of have that moment of revelation when you hear this piece with totally new ears. At least I think you will. So pretty fascinating, right? And one of the things that you probably noticed right away is that he actually plays this piece, I'll reveal the pianist's name in a moment, but he actually plays this piece in a quite rhythmically varied way. He kind of starts a little bit slower, and he allows there to be these ritardandi and accelerandi and so forth. He's kind of speeding up and slowing down. And it's actually a very striking effect. It's amazing how kind of spooky and atmospheric the style is. It's also quite free with pedal. I think 90% of people who play this piece play it dry with no pedal at all. But he's actually kind of using the pedal to paint a musical picture, which I think is really extraordinary. You hear too many people playing this piece in a really etude-like way, and not enough people who are really sensitive to the poetry, which is actually present in this music. Beyond that, you probably also caught his voicing of the inner lines, which is quite striking. I mean, of course, there's nothing written in the original to suggest doing this, but it's quite interesting the way that he brings these things out. Even though this is a slower performance tempo than the one by Backhaus or many modern performances, in some ways what he's doing is actually more impressive. Certainly it is for me, because bringing out the inner parts the way he does is actually very, very difficult. He's oftentimes switching between the thumb note and the index finger note in the chords to bring out those melodies. And the amount of control and practice that must have required to really get that is actually mind-boggling. And in a way, it's even more impressive than those people who have just practiced the piece endlessly over long periods of time and who have developed the ability to be able to play it at 170 or 180 or whatever. That's more of a mechanical impressiveness, and this is more of something a little deeper and more subtle. So would I necessarily choose to play the piece like this in my own recording? Well, I don't know. I think not, because I have some kind of different ideas about how I imagine it should go. However, it is very, very inspiring that he found something that was so unique there. So the pianist, by the way, in case you're, I'm sure you're wondering about who was this pianist, is a pianist by the name of Vitaly Margulis. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but Margulis was a Ukrainian pianist, moved to the United States, taught in California, and actually not that well known. I didn't know Margulis before this, but having heard this recording, I want to find more of his playing because it's really striking and original. And I guess it just goes to show you that amazing pianists are hiding all over the place. They're not always the famous names. And if you're just a little open-minded to listen to someone who's perhaps unknown, quote unquote unknown, you can find performances that are just treasures. And it's wonderful to have this idiosyncratic performance in the pantheon of performances of this piece. I'm one of those people who thinks that you can never have too many different interpretations of a particular piece of music. Every one is always just going to give you a little bit more knowledge about the piece in question and give you a new perspective on what you're hearing, what you're looking at. Just as an aside, too, many of those performances you might hear that are super, super, super fast nowadays, some of the pianists are actually doing a little bit of a cheat, such as Valentina Lisitsa, actually. Valentina Lisitsa is just one example of this, not to denigrate her performances or anything like that, but if you look at her video of this etude, you can actually see that in many places she's not playing the inner note of this chord in the right hand. So her index finger is just kind of flying up and just kind of being free. It's actually quite a clever facilitation to leave that note out sometimes. I think sometimes she does play the full chord, sometimes she doesn't. And you can hear other pianists who also do that, which makes it even more impressive, actually. There are some pianists who play it super, super fast, like Backhaus, and actually play all the notes, and it's quite impressive that they can do that. It does require that you have a piano which is somewhat light to be able to do that as well. At the end of all this, I decided to go back and listen to one of my old favorites who I hadn't heard play this piece in a very, very long time, which is, of course, Alfred Cortot. And I was quite interested to hear Cortot's interpretation is also very beautiful. He manages to make the non-pedaled kind of interpretation. Also, basically at Chopin's metronome marking, he manages to make it very, very atmospheric and beautiful and spooky in a way that few performances are. Something about his tone is just really gorgeous and velvety and a very, very subtle kind of performance. Certainly more straightforward rhythmically than Margulis. But I was really interested to hear that actually he does a little bit of this kind of voicing, of bringing out things in the inner voices in the recapitulation of the theme. Not exactly the same as Margulis, but it's actually there, one of the few performances where someone does that. It made me think that perhaps Margulis himself was a little bit influenced by Cortot in forming his own, even more striking interpretation. So I'll leave you with the Alfred Cortot recording of this Etude. So obviously, I'm going to be coming up with another video of this at some point where I'm going to perform it myself. I'm taking my time, though, just to kind of let it sink in because I want to play it to the best that I'm able to do, and it's quite a difficult etude. It's one of those pieces that you have to let sit in your fingers for a while. So yeah, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this little look at Chopin's most difficult etude. Stay tuned next week. I'll have more great music, of course, as always, great conversation. And yeah, here we go with Cortot's performance of Chopin's Opus 10 No. 2.